No one expects their life to shift under neon lights and the sharp crash of bowling pins, but that Friday night at Maple Grove Lanes carried a quiet tension Emily Harper could not yet name. She had planned the evening for weeks, hoping to bring back a spark of fun into her family's routine. 12 years of marriage to Daniel had settled into something steady and practical, filled with school schedules, grocery lists, and polite goodnight kisses that once used to linger longer. Their kids, Liam and Sophie, raced ahead toward Lane 6, laughing and fighting over who would bowl first, while Emily followed with a warm smile, believing that small family nights like this kept love strong. Daniel carried the shoes and joked with the kids, but there was a slight delay in his laughter, a faint distraction in his eyes that flickered every time his phone buzzed in his pocket. Emily noticed it but told herself it was work stress. He had mentioned a new project, long hours, pressure from management. She chose trust because trust had always been easy for her. The first game began with cheerful teasing, high fives, and playful groans over gutter balls, and for a moment everything felt normal again. Emily watched Daniel carefully when he thought no one was looking. He smiled at the kids, yet something about his expression seemed distant, like a man standing in two places at once. When her turn came, she bowled a clean strike, and Daniel clapped proudly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders in a familiar gesture that still felt comforting, yet even that hug seemed lighter, shorter. Halfway through the second game, Emily offered to grab drinks and walk toward the snack counter, weaving through families and teenagers, breathing in the scent of popcorn and soda syrup, unaware that those few steps would become the line dividing before and after. As she waited for their order, she glanced down the row of lanes and saw Daniel near the far wall, standing closer to someone than casual distance required. The woman beside him looked calm and confident, her dark blonde hair resting softly over her sweater, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested familiarity. Emily slowed her breathing and watched without meaning to stare. Daniel leaned in slightly, his face softer than it had been all evening, his smile different, less playful, more personal. The woman laughed quietly at something he said, and Daniel's eyes held hers in a way that felt intimate, even from across the room. It was not dramatic. They were not touching. Yet something about the air around them felt charged with private meaning. When Daniel noticed Emily watching, his body straightened quickly, like someone pulled back into place, and the woman stepped away with a polite nod before turning toward another lane. Emily collected the drinks with steady hands and walked back, her heart beating faster than it should have for such an ordinary scene. She placed the cups down and met Daniel's gaze. "Who was that?" she asked lightly, keeping her tone smooth for the children's sake. Daniel answered too quickly, calling the woman Claire and explaining she worked at his office. He said it was a coincidence, nothing more, just small-town timing. Emily nodded, offering a small smile, telling herself she was being unreasonable, telling herself marriages required faith, telling herself she trusted her husband. The game resumed, the kids cheered, and the noise of bowling balls masked the quiet questions forming inside her chest. She noticed Daniel checking his phone again, his thumb moving fast, then sliding it back into his pocket when she looked over. She tried to focus on Liam's excited shout and Sophie's dramatic spin before her throw, but her mind replayed Daniel's expression near lane 7. It wasn't the presence of another woman that unsettled her, it was the softness in his face, a softness she realized she hadn't seen directed at her in months. On the drive home, the kids argued about scores in the back seat while Emily stared out the window, watching streetlights blur into long streaks of gold. Daniel hummed along to the radio, acting normal, yet his silence between songs felt heavy. At home, they tucked the kids into bed, kissed foreheads, and exchanged the usual tired smiles. Later, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Emily lay awake listening to Daniel's breathing beside her. She remembered how their love once felt urgent and bright, how he used to reach for her hand without thinking, how their conversations used to stretch long past midnight. Somewhere along the years, routine had replaced wonder, and responsibility had dulled spontaneity. She wondered if she had changed too, if motherhood and schedules had made her less interesting, less attentive. She hated that thought but could not stop it from forming. Daniel shifted in his sleep and turned away slightly, and even that small movement felt symbolic. Emily stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment again, Claire's laugh, Daniel's lean toward her, the quick straightening when caught. It could mean nothing. It could mean everything. The hardest part was not knowing. She did not want to accuse him unfairly. She did not want to become suspicious or bitter. She wanted to believe that what she saw was harmless. Yet her instincts whispered that something had shifted long before that night. Perhaps it had begun with small silences at dinner, with tired goodnights, with conversations about bills instead of dreams. Maybe both of them had drifted without realizing it. Still, there was a difference between drifting and reaching for someone else to fill the gap. Emily closed her eyes and told herself she would not jump to conclusions. She would watch. She would listen. She would protect her family quietly if she had to. But deep down, she knew that bowling night had revealed a crack in the surface of their steady life, and cracks, once seen, could not be unseen. As the house settled into silence and the glow of the digital clock marked each passing minute, Emily understood one simple, painful truth: something had begun under those neon lights, and whether it was innocent or not, her heart had felt the shift before her mind could explain it. In the weeks after that bowling night, life in the Harper house looked normal on the outside, but small changes began to move quietly through the rooms like cold air through a cracked window. Daniel started coming home later than usual, always with a reasonable excuse: traffic, meetings, last-minute emails, nothing dramatic enough to question, yet frequent enough to feel new. Emily tried to keep her routine steady for the kids, packing lunches, helping with homework, smiling at dinner, but she could not ignore how often Daniel's phone lit up beside his plate. He would glance at it quickly, sometimes smile, sometimes type back fast, then flip it face down as if the screen were suddenly too bright. When she asked about his day, his answers were shorter than before, polished and simple, as though he had already told the interesting parts to someone else. One Thursday evening, he mentioned joining a bowling league with co-workers to clear his head, and though Emily nodded supportively, her chest tightened at the thought of Maple Grove Lanes and the woman named Claire. She did not want to sound insecure, so she encouraged him, telling herself that healthy couples allowed space. Yet space, she was learning, can slowly turn into distance. Daniel began dressing with more care on those Thursdays, choosing newer shirts, checking his reflection twice before leaving, and while that might have once pleased her, now it unsettled her. Emily watched these details quietly, collecting them like puzzle pieces she was afraid to assemble. One afternoon, she decided to surprise him at work with lunch, hoping to reconnect in a simple, thoughtful way. She carried his favorite sandwich into the office lobby, smiling at the receptionist, her heart beating faster than it should for a sweet gesture. Through the glass walls of a conference room, she saw Daniel sitting across from Claire. They were not doing anything improper, they were simply talking, leaning slightly toward one another, sharing a laugh that felt relaxed and private. Claire brushed her hair behind her ear as Daniel spoke, his expression open, attentive, the kind of look he used to give Emily during their early years. Emily stood frozen, the sandwich bag crinkling softly in her grip. She noticed Daniel reach forward and lightly brush a speck of lint from Claire's sleeve, a small caring motion that lasted only a second but carried weight. Claire smiled warmly at him, and in that moment, Emily felt invisible. She stepped back before anyone saw her and walked out of the building, the automatic doors sliding closed behind her with a quiet final sound. On the drive home, her thoughts raced. Was she imagining something bigger than it was? Was this just friendship? She wanted proof, yet she feared it too. That night, Daniel mentioned having a busy afternoon and working through lunch, and Emily felt a sharp sting at the lie, not because of what he was doing, but because of how easily it came. Trust, once simple, now felt fragile. She began noticing how often Claire's name entered conversations, always in professional context, always harmless on the surface. Claire suggested a new idea. Claire thinks the client will agree. Each mention was casual, yet frequent enough to feel deliberate. Emily tried to talk to Daniel one evening after the kids were asleep, her voice calm but trembling underneath. "Are we okay?" she asked softly, not accusing, just searching. Daniel looked surprised, then tired. He blamed stress, deadlines, pressure. He reached for her hand, but his grip lacked the warmth she remembered. She wanted to believe him, and part of her did, yet another part sensed a wall forming between them. Days passed with polite conversation and shared responsibilities, but the emotional rhythm felt offbeat. Daniel laughed more at his phone than at the dinner table. He guarded it gently, not obviously, but enough. Emily found herself lying awake at night, replaying small moments, measuring tone, searching for reassurance in gestures that once came naturally. She did not want to become suspicious or bitter, she valued dignity and calm. Yet ignoring her instincts felt like betraying herself. One Thursday, when Daniel left for bowling again, Emily watched from the window as his car disappeared down the street, and for a brief second she considered following him. She did not. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her, realizing that loneliness can exist even in a shared home. She missed the version of Daniel who used to talk about dreams, who used to ask about her day with real curiosity, who once looked at her the way she had seen him look at Claire. She wondered if routine had slowly drained the color from their marriage or if someone else had simply stepped into a space that had been left unguarded. When Daniel returned that night, he smelled faintly of cologne he had not worn in months. It was subtle, but noticeable. He kissed her cheek and asked about the kids, moving through the house as though nothing had shifted. Emily smiled gently, choosing calm over confrontation, yet inside she felt the growing certainty that something emotional had begun long before either of them admitted it. She understood that affairs do not always start with grand gestures, sometimes they begin with shared complaints, long conversations, feeling understood. And that realization hurt more than any dramatic scene could have. As she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, she faced the ceiling and accepted a difficult truth. Whatever was forming between Daniel and Claire might still be undefined, but it was no longer harmless in her heart. The distance between her and her husband was not measured in miles or even words, it was measured in attention, in softness, in where he chose to invest his emotional energy. And as the quiet house settled around her, Emily knew that pretending not to see the shift would only allow it to grow. The tension that had been building quietly inside Emily finally pushed her to act on a cool Thursday evening when Daniel once again said he would be late for bowling, his voice casual but his eyes avoiding hers for a split second too long. After tucking Liam and Sophie into bed and kissing their foreheads, Emily stood alone in the hallway, her heart beating fast with a mix of fear and determination. She told herself she only needed clarity, not drama, not anger, just the truth. Before she could overthink it, she grabbed her keys and drove toward Maple Grove Lanes, the familiar neon sign glowing against the dark sky like a memory she wished she could rewrite. Inside, the sounds were the same: pins crashing, shoes sliding, laughter echoing, but to Emily everything felt sharper, louder. She scanned the lanes slowly until she saw Daniel near lane 7, sitting beside Claire at a small round table instead of bowling. There were no other co-workers around. Just the two of them, their bodies angled toward each other in quiet focus. Claire was speaking softly, her expression open, and Daniel was listening in a way that looked intimate, his shoulders relaxed, his face thoughtful. Emily watched him smile at something she said, not a polite smile but one that reached his eyes. Then Claire gently placed her hand on his arm as she finished her sentence, a light touch, brief but deliberate. Daniel did not pull away. He covered her hand for a second with his own, as if offering comfort. That simple gesture confirmed what Emily had feared, not a physical betrayal, but an emotional connection growing stronger than friendship. Her chest tightened, yet she walked forward calmly until Daniel looked up and saw her standing there. The color drained from his face instantly. Claire followed his gaze and froze. The noise of the bowling alley seemed to fade around them. "Emily," Daniel said, standing quickly, his voice unsteady. Claire stepped back, her expression shifting from warmth to discomfort. "I think I should go," she murmured softly before grabbing her purse and walking away without meeting Emily's eyes. Emily felt surprisingly steady. She was not shaking. She was not shouting. She simply looked at her husband, searching his face for honesty. "We need to talk," she said quietly. The drive home was silent except for the hum of the engine. Daniel kept both hands tight on the steering wheel. At the kitchen table, under the warm yellow light that had witnessed so many ordinary family dinners, they finally faced each other without distractions. Daniel exhaled deeply, as if holding his breath for weeks. "It wasn't supposed to become this," he began, his voice low. Emily listened without interrupting. He explained that it started with simple conversations at work, shared frustrations, shared jokes. Claire had been going through a difficult time in her own life, and Daniel had offered support. In return, she listened to him talk about stress, about feeling overlooked, about missing excitement. "I didn't plan it," he said, his eyes glossy with emotion. "I didn't wake up wanting to hurt you." Emily's voice was calm but firm. "Have you crossed a line?" Daniel hesitated only a second. "Not physically," he answered honestly, "but emotionally, yes." The admission hung heavy between them. Emily felt the weight of those words press against her heart. Emotional betrayal was harder to define, harder to defend against. "Why?" she asked, not angrily, but sincerely. Daniel looked down at his hands. "I felt seen," he admitted. "She noticed things about me. She asked questions. I didn't realize how disconnected I'd been feeling until someone paid attention." His words were painful, not because they were cruel, but because they were real. Emily swallowed the ache rising in her throat. "And you didn't think I wanted to see you?" she asked softly. Daniel looked up quickly. "You do. I know you do. We got lost in routine. Bills. Kids. Responsibilities. I felt like we stopped being us." Emily absorbed that quietly. She knew marriage could slip into habit. She knew life became busy. But instead of turning toward her, he had turned toward someone else. That was the wound. "You should have told me," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "I can handle hard conversations. I can't handle secrets." Daniel nodded slowly. "You're right." There was no defensiveness left in him now, only regret. He admitted they had been texting daily, sharing thoughts that once would have been shared at home. Nothing inappropriate in words, but intimate in tone. Private in meaning. "I didn't think it was an affair," he said. "I kept telling myself it wasn't." Emily leaned back in her chair, feeling both shattered and strangely clear. The truth hurt, but it removed the fog. She realized the issue was not just Claire, it was the quiet distance that had formed long before Claire stepped into the picture. They had both allowed routine to replace connection. Yet Daniel had chosen to seek comfort elsewhere instead of repairing what was fading. That choice mattered. "Do you love her?" Emily asked, needing the answer no matter how much it might hurt. Daniel shook his head immediately. "No. I care about her, but I love you. I love our family." Emily studied his face carefully. She saw fear there, not of being caught, but of losing everything. "Then you have to decide," she said firmly. "Because this can't continue in any form." Daniel nodded again, more certain this time. "I'll end it. Completely." The room fell quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street. Inside, their world felt fragile but honest for the first time in weeks. Emily felt tears finally slide down her cheeks, not dramatic sobs, just steady grief for the innocence their marriage had lost. Daniel moved closer but stopped short of touching her, waiting for permission. That small pause told her he understood the damage. Part of her wanted to walk away from the table and protect her heart. Another part remembered the years they had built together, the births of their children, late-night talks, shared dreams. This was not a stranger across from her. It was her husband, flawed and human. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted quietly. Daniel nodded. "Neither do I. But I want to fix this." And in that simple exchange, with honesty finally laid bare, Emily understood that the real storm had not been at the bowling alley. It was here, in the space between two people deciding whether love was strong enough to survive the truth. The days after the truth came out felt fragile, like walking across thin ice, because nothing in the Harper home looked broken yet everything felt different, and Emily moved through each morning with quiet strength while Daniel carried visible regret in his eyes. He sent the message to Claire the very next day, clear and respectful, ending all contact and taking responsibility for allowing things to cross emotional boundaries, and he showed Emily before pressing send, not as a performance but as proof that he understood trust had to be rebuilt with action, not promises. Claire replied briefly, wishing him well and agreeing that distance was best, and with that, the outside connection ended, but the real work remained inside their marriage. Emily felt waves of emotion, sadness, anger, doubt, but she refused to let bitterness define her, because she knew her children were watching and because deep down she still loved the man sitting across from her at the dinner table, even if her heart was bruised. Daniel began coming home earlier without being asked, leaving his phone on the counter instead of in his hand, offering small updates about his day before she even had to wonder, and though these gestures seemed simple, they carried weight because consistency slowly rebuilds safety. They agreed to counseling, something neither of them had imagined needing, yet sitting in that quiet office with a licensed therapist forced them to speak honestly in ways they had avoided for years. Daniel admitted he had felt unnoticed and restless, not unloved but disconnected, and Emily admitted she had felt taken for granted and overwhelmed, pouring energy into motherhood and routine while missing the affection that once came naturally between them. There were no dramatic fights in those sessions, only steady conversations about expectations, communication, and how emotional affairs often begin with unmet needs rather than bad intentions, a lesson both painful and clarifying. Emily learned that healing did not mean excusing what happened, it meant deciding whether rebuilding was worth the effort, and Daniel understood that forgiveness would not arrive quickly but would grow through patience. At home, they began making intentional changes, scheduling time together after the kids went to bed, sitting on the porch with coffee instead of scrolling through phones, asking real questions again about dreams, about fears, about what they missed in each other. It felt awkward at first, like strangers relearning steps to a dance they once knew by heart, yet slowly warmth returned in small sparks. One evening Daniel reached for her hand across the couch and held it gently, not out of habit but purpose, and Emily felt something steady instead of uncertain. She still had moments of doubt when memories of Lane 7 flashed in her mind, but instead of staying silent she voiced her feelings, and Daniel listened without defensiveness, understanding that rebuilding trust meant allowing space for her hurt. Weeks turned into months, and the atmosphere in their home shifted from fragile to hopeful. Laughter at dinner sounded natural again, and the children sensed the lighter mood without knowing the full story. Emily realized that pain had forced them to confront what comfort had allowed them to ignore, and while she wished the lesson had come differently, she could not deny that honesty had brought clarity. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel surprised the family by suggesting they go bowling again, and for a second Emily's heart tightened at the thought, but she agreed, knowing that avoiding places would not heal wounds. Maple Grove lanes looked unchanged, the same neon lights, the same music, but this time Daniel walked beside her with steady attention, carrying her ball along with his own, making small jokes that felt genuine. As Liam cheered over a strike and Sophie spun dramatically before her turn, Daniel slipped his hand into Emily's and squeezed it softly, a quiet reminder that he was present, fully present. She studied his face under the bright lights and saw intention instead of distraction, humility instead of distance. There was no dramatic speech, no grand apology in that moment, just the steady rhythm of family laughter and the simple act of standing side by side. Emily understood then that love after betrayal does not look like fairy tales, it looks like choice, repeated daily, through effort and honesty. She knew scars would remain, but scars are proof of healing, not weakness. As they left the bowling alley that night, the cool air brushing against them, Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders and asked softly, "Are we okay?" Emily looked up at him, thinking of the long conversations, the tears, the counseling sessions, the quiet evenings spent rebuilding what had almost slipped away. "We're working on it," she replied with a small but sincere smile, and that felt true. Their world had been shaken by emotional infidelity, but it had not collapsed. Instead, it had forced them to see each other again, not as roommates or routine partners, but as two imperfect people capable of choosing each other with intention. And as they drove home with the kids laughing in the back seat, Emily realized that the night that once threatened to break her family had instead become the turning point that taught them how to protect it, because love is not defined by never facing temptation or distance, but by the courage to return, repair, and stand together when everything feels uncertain.